Good evening. I'm Mario Gooden. I am a member of the Board of Directors of the Architectural League and a member of this year's jury for the 2016 Emerging Voices. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight for our first evening of the Emerging Voices series. The Architectural League of New York, Emerging Voices, identifies leading talents in architecture and design in the US, Canada, and Mexico, with distinct design voices and significant bodies of work. Tonight's honorees, as well as the honorees on the next 3 Tuesdays, are architects that have something to say as well as something to show. And it will be my distinct pleasure this evening to introduce the first two to you, Jon Lott and Heather Roberge. But first, I'd like to just make a few acknowledgments, beginning with a note of thanks to our supporters. The Emerging Voices is generously supported by Elise Jaffe and Jeffrey Brown, and I believe they are seated right there. And also the Emerging Voices program is generously supported by the Next Generation Fund of the Architectural League. Architectural League programs are additionally supported in part by public funds from the New York State Council on the Arts, and with the support of Governor Andrew Cuomo and the City of New York Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. I'd also like to thank the Architects newspaper for its feature of this year's class in the most recent issue of the Architects newspaper. And then finally, I'd like to acknowledge my fellow Emerging Voices jurors for this year, Sunil Bald, Henry Cobb, Carrie Jacobs, Anna Katz, Tom Pfeiffer, and Billy Sin. Now on to this evening's program. The work of our recipients tonight is notable for their investigations into what might be called critical. As we shall see, both our Emerging Voices are engaged in work that is resistant and oppositional and cannot be reduced to conciliatory representations of external forces, nor to a dogmatic, reproducible formal system. First, I'd like to introduce Jon Lott. Jon is principal of Para Project, which he co-founded in 2007, and a co-founding member of Collective-LOK, together with William O'Brien Jr. and Michael Kubo, founded in 2013. Jon is also a design critic in architecture at Harvard's Graduate School of Design, and I should note that he is a past Architectural League Prize winner. Jon states that in his work that he's interested in collaborative models of practice, the advantage of the discipline's generalist position, and the consumption of culture as a tool for typological distortion. Viewing his work, that particular combination of pedagogical intentions, however, produces a striking lucidity that is both figuratively and literally lucid in his work. Yet there is also subversion in that lucidity, which we'll see tonight, which undermines any reductivist reading of the work and results in what Michael Hayes coins as a critical architecture. In Jon's work, that critical architecture is engaged in cultural critique while simultaneously being highly self-aware of the very discipline of architecture as a unique mode of cultural production with its own logics, histories, and contradictions, resulting in what we will see as lucid complexities. So please join me in welcoming Jon Lott.
Okay, thank you, Mario, and thank you, Anne, and to the League. It is a real honor to be included in this series, and so I thank the League and the board for that acknowledgement. I've been influenced personally by so many on the list, so it's really a privilege. I want to go through a number of projects quickly. The talk is separated into sort of 2 portions. The first 4 projects of my own practice, and then 4 projects at the collective practice, but much quicker. because I feel like this relationship between the personal practice and the collective practice is very essential in my work. I framed I sort of titled the talk informally, Wholes and Clockwork. I want to talk about the projects as wholes. A subtitle for the talk might be Headspace. This is Headspace, a bust that I made for an exhibition in Los Angeles, curated by William O'Brien Jr., where 11 architects were asked to produce a bust in architectural terms. But rather than create an object on a pedestal, which the bust in sculpture typically would, I wanted to make a space for the face. So this is Florian's face in my space. He had a bust in the show as well. And I won't go into detail on this project, but it's really, it was very personal, but also a kind of how to concern oneself with the space of architecture or the wholes that we make rather than the objects. And so as you look into this viewing device, there is a mirror behind that puts you back out in the context outside of yourself. So there really is nothing there in the end. One of the first projects that I did before I get to the wholes was for submission by invitation to 306090, which is a publication I think no longer running by Jonathan Solomon and Emily Abruzzo. It was a fantastic publication, and this one we got asked to submit on the topic of decoration. And so I went to Mies and asked, what if Mies were to receive a facelift? How would the current Mies, if you will, decorate? Not Mies literally, but the Seagram's Tower was my case study. And I was curious as to the Ibeam as decoration and how, in Mies's case, there was a sort of Fordist agenda to the Ibeam as a part of the face, and how, if it were updated according to post-Fordist logics, how it would manifest itself. And so it was really about a kind of post-Fordist manipulation as a series of modifications, and less so a proposal, but more a critique of why we manipulate through digital fabrication simply because we can. And there's this kind of, I felt like at the time starting the practice, a kind of absurd level of iterative offerings to the face of the building simply because now we can. And so this is a scene from Moulin Rouge using Fatboy Slim's Because We Can, where there's this kind of delirious sense of possibility. But I'm more interested in the kind of aftermath of the crash, starting the practice 2008, 2009, and rather than pursue the sort of post-Fordist manipulation of the face, I'm interested in this slide for two reasons. Because I'm curious to see how we'll heal from that agenda, the culture of excess, as we see now some simplification in architecture, but also that the mask is something that causes concern for the thing behind it, or the space that the mask suggests rather than the face, and the whole rather than the object. In one last sort of setup for the talk, I was curious at the time, again, why we manipulate and what the motives are for these manipulations, and was interested in how the Rorschach was a type of ambiguity for familiar types and primitives, that there was an awareness of the primitive, but an alien quality through this kind of ambiguity. This is an installation at the League for the Architectural League Prize. So, the first whole. The four projects that I'll mention are all in Syracuse, New York, and I have to thank Mark Robbins, who was my dean at the time I was teaching there, who, because of whom these projects mostly I was introduced to the client or became possible largely because of Mark, so Mark to thank tremendously for these. This project was a very small project for an attic conversion for a couple who were writers. And the problem was how to capitalize on a very tiny space with very little room. So it was really this space here that was high enough to stand. And so it was about creating, maximizing the sense and the quality of the space, and creating these kind of niche programs along the sides, sort of formalized it, and the plan. Emphasizing the continuity of the space outside and stitching it back in a kind of Rorschach-like manner, so that the exterior was linked back to the rear. Some initial studies about these niches and how they behave according to this horizontal expansion. The problem was that this existing stair was ended mid-space, and so really we had to figure out ways to move it back and push it back to make it steeper and bring it to the second level, so that we have this clearing out of the central spine and capitalizing on that expansion in the sort of only room available. At the rear of the space, there is a bookcase which has a series of small mirrored bookends paired with openings, so that there is because we couldn't blow the face out on the front, there is a sense of expansion, though it's primarily through reflection of this side in the reflective bits here. At the rear of the space as well, there's a vertical expansion, so it goes from horizontal to vertical. The initial agenda was a much more radical vertical expansion, but we decided to pull back the edge of the vertical to align with some of the plan geometries. And here you see a little bit closer the sense of expansion through this face, even though it's simply reflection and a detail. And I was interested as well, and you'll see a lot of play on reflection in the work about how there's a kind of doubling outside the space that is inaccessible, but that you're sort of aware of. At the same time of starting the practice in 2008 or 9, a friend of mine who's a songwriter wrote this song, which I feel like captured the angst that I had as an early practitioner, where there was a lot of architecture that I felt like was maybe too slick, too maybe even sometimes, unfortunately, useless. And so there was a critique about the direction that we were headed under the culture of excess, and became interested in returning to a kind of primitive and the simplicity and the beauty of space rather than making of objects. So the second hole is also in Syracuse, New York, for a cultural center for a Latino group called La Casita. And they were interested in creating, actually borrowing from a phenomena that happened in the 70s in the Bronx, where there was a series of fires, and the locals built these very sort of humble houses where they would gather and for cultural activities. But the problem was their site was inside of a warehouse, and so they wanted this house, but this should say versus actually, because it was inside. I felt like we could deal with the typology of the house in some way liberated from external demands, and so the project was about exploiting the frame and distorting the balloon frame type to fit and to negotiate the fixed program, which you see here, a little library, classroom, kitchen, office, and storage, with the flexible program of a gallery and a kind of performance space. And so this frame is a sort of single device that bends and manages the relationship between all of these parts. An early rendering showing that the frame and a few simple curtains to divide as necessary. And then the space built is really about connecting all the parts, the two ends as being a single space yet distinct, and striking that balance between separation and connection. And really exploiting the frame where you have a library and a reading room paired. You have a classroom, and here you have little display for the children's work here. opposite in plan. So this is about exploiting the frame and the sort of gallery area here. From the performance space looking back, so the spaces again are connected but distinct. Separating that space off when necessary. Here you see the classroom connected, which this curtain can be drawn to be separated from the kitchen. And it's really about the simplicity of the frame to allow for that connection and separation. Okay, third hole, also in Syracuse. This one also for 2 writers. The clients owned the White House on the left, and they wanted to convert the attic, or sorry, they wanted to convert, that's the other project, they wanted to convert the garage to a writing studio. And so when I saw this context, I immediately thought of this project. And this is Johnny Petna. I actually studied with Johnny in Italy when I was a 4th-year undergraduate, as well as Cristiano Tiraldo di Francia of Super Studio. But I always loved this project of Johnny's. And when I saw this context, I thought it just was too coincidental or perfect. And started to imagine, well, what I love about this project by Johnny is that for me it feels like this kind of a placeholder for type, right? In the repetition of the suburban context, this for me is a kind of blank placeholder for what the type could be. And I know for Johnny it's about swallowing a house in ice, but for me I was curious about how that type of gap in the sequence, a kind of hole, if you will, in the repetition of the type, could operate as a space for writing, as a place for clarity, as a kind of blank spot in the suburbs. And so the project completed is this 3-level writing studio. The lowest level is a garage. This double height space, you'll see in a minute, is a writing space, and then there's a small reading space on the 3rd floor. The clients didn't want to see out into the sort of neighborhood, and so the skin of the project is fabric, which is a translucent, it's like a rubberized fiberglass sheet, very thin, it's like 3 mil. And so it's really about letting light in, but not allowing the view to overpower the space. So there's just one little moment here and one moment here that actually you can kind of see out into the neighborhood. So the south elevation is like this. The other reference for the project is Melnikov's studio. In his studio plays with the Venn diagram of spaces in plan, and I try this in section. And so the section, you see the garage and the library and the writing space, and this bowl-shaped 3rd level, which is a soft room for reading, light-filled from above, you'll see. But this also subtly separates the sides of a tub and writing. And so there is this kind of Venn relationship of the exterior as a single made up through the porosity here that is paired with the 3 distinct spaces. The ceiling in the 3rd level is gold on the ceiling, reflective a little bit to give the sense of a kind of spherical place. The direction of this room is really up, and the direction of this space is really horizontal. Some early study models of the 3rd level. And this is the completed 3rd level. As you rise up, there's a gap which gives you a view back down to the tub on the 2nd level, and a glimpse out to the rear yard. And this is the soft sort of reading room naturally lit from skylights above. The tub was a client request. Actually, the first thing they asked for is we want a space to write with a tub. But so it's a hole inside the hole, if you will, but really intentionally continuous with the horizontal datum that allows for that continuity to the rear yard out. And again, you see here the library plays with that confusion of surface and reflection and openings such that there is a kind of collapse of what's behind and what's beyond in what actually makes up that divider. And so this is another version of that experiment that started in the attic. Some studies about the ergonomics of the tub, the three positions of the clients were studied and measured. I have this amazing drawing, stick figure drawing of one of the clients of their dimensions. And then the tub with radiant heat being set in integral to the floor. This is the entry from the house, sort of curved around before the door was installed. Sorry, the photo is bad, it's an iPhone photo, but entering the space. So here you see the existing house, this bridge at the second level, this kind of dark asphaltic tar connection to the writing room. And the plan entering at this level here, the primary library, and then the third floor, the reading room there. From the rear yard at night, paired with their house. This is the only operable portion of the skin. It's the same material, but just much thinner and on the inside for privacy. And then the bottom operates as a kind of breezeway to allow for that continuity when desired. Reflection of the rear yard in the snow. And so a project like this was really possible because of the context and this kind of play with the repetition of the suburbs, that I could try this object as a whole, as a gap. Okay, fourth whole. This one for Syracuse University. This is for Huntington Hall, which is the School of Education at Syracuse University. And there was a competition that we won. And they needed, Huntington Hall was originally a hospital, and this is an old photo, it's since expanded, but in the original entry from the street was here, this portion. The dean, so this is looking down at that piece here, and this is the edge of campus, and this is the sort of main quad and main artery, University Ave, leading to the city, sort of. And this is the kind of commercial district. And so the dean wanted to re-engage the context with a grand entry or new entry and lobby, because in the 70s, this is zooming in, there was a fence around the old entry, and the faculty and students had to enter from the back, and it was this kind of really confusing sense of orientation. So it was smart to need to reposition the sense of entry and orientation in the school. And so our proposal, there's two phases to this project proposed. The first is this kind of lobby event space that becomes the primary entry and connection, and also hub for the school. And the second was this auditorium piece, which is an additive. And so the proposal was to get rid of the fence, to allow for this, to create a hole, to allow for this direct connection back to University Ave here, to link it back to the campus and to the commercial context. And so here is the face that we operated on. And it was not about an additive strategy. It was really simply a strategy of removal, creating a hole to allow for this kind of frame for the lobby space where the activity of the school could be highlighted. So I was very intrigued by Sugimoto's exposures, where the content can be imagined as always changing, but the frame is really what gives you the sense for what happens here. As well as the race to Kooning, where the original is remembered, but the possibility of the blank is kind of fosters the imagination. And so this is Bishop Huntington, and I suppose his nurses, the founder of the space. And so I saw the building as one of these devices that you put your head in that can always be updated depending on who shoves their face in Bishop Huntington. So it was about clearing out this area and leaving this as a frame. And so the built entry is a simple receding glass plane that meets the edge and then falls back to create a sense for, and this is thanks to Silman Associates, who solved the structure for us, to allow that hole to link you back to University Ave. This long gradual ramp, accessible for all. And here you see that plane coming to this kind of knife edge point, which is important because when the light conditions are right, the reflection is one that doubles and creates this kind of symmetry with context. But also when the lighting changes, there's this transparency linking you. And so in the urban connection here. The second phase of this project, which the hole gets deeper, there was a proposal for an auditorium in the back that I still have my fingers crossed for. They're in fundraising. It's sort of paused in DD. What the initial phase was, or the initial proposal, was a sort of bowl-nosed amphitheater or auditorium space, rather, for lectures, etc., linked directly to the lobby space here as you walk in. So this could work as a sort of overflow close-up of that auditorium. And some studies about how to create a majority of this, have it be accessible but still have line of sight addressed. And so it sort of ended with these studies of a twisted, raked auditorium. Okay. Now I want to go into the collective projects. I collaborate, as Mario mentioned, with William O'Brien Jr. and Michael Kubo. And together we worked on 6 projects. I'll briefly, quickly go through 4. We came together to enter the competition for the Van Alen Institute space. For most of you who are, if most of you are familiar, the Van Alen is on 22nd Street. And they owned this building, and they were on the 6th floor at one point, and then on the 4th floor, and the new director, David, was insistent that if the Van Alen is about exposing architecture to the public and engaging the public, that we really need to be on the ground floor to maximize that kind of accessibility to what we're doing. And so they wanted to convert the first floor space to their new headquarters. And so we entered the competition as a first experiment in collaborating together, and has since led to other collaborations, intentionally maintaining our own practices, the 3 of us, but finding the space for collaboration through competitions as a way to fuel our individual practices respectively. And so we're very happy with this model of having both collaboration and the kind of individual space. And so for the Van Alen, we had many references in mind, and the first was Nishi's Discovering Columbus. Is everyone familiar with this project in the city a few years ago? To me, this project was really amazing, and it really captured this idea of framing something which is otherwise inaccessible in the city, and by bracketing that thing properly, and using the context of a living room in this case, you're able to familiarize that thing and understand it in a way that seems incredibly normal. And so we try this at the Van Alen, of bracketing that inaccessible, or the barrier to the institution, right, through a proper bracketing of that space. The other thing we were curious about is apparently you can opt out on Google Street View. And this happens a lot, apparently in Berlin. And so there are these opt-out screens, and we became very curious about not necessarily what's happening here, but why these, what's so important, why do these guys need to hide? So there's this really interesting play on publicity and exposure where there's a curiosity created now through the screen. And so the project became about a screenplay in 2 ways, trying to bracket spaces, including the public, but also strategically allowing the Van Alen to have options within their space but also creating the allure through screens about what the Institute really has to offer. And so it's about a series of screens that become activated as needed. This is a sort of primary screen which separates fixed program from the flexible. The other two screens proposed, this was a kind of the screen for the face, and then a rear yard screen, which are both reflective and porous, such that when you walk through, there is a reflection of the space inside of the screen. A projection screen, which projects content onto this sort of display wall. And then a ceiling screen, which manages all the utility, light, heat, etc. And the plan is a very simple bow tie, allowing the kind of, again, the continuity, but subtle separation of one main space and a secondary space where you have all the fixed conference rooms, library, bathrooms, etc., linked or shut off to the flexible main space as necessary. And this is the Van Alen built before they moved in, where you see this kind of diaphanous screen of the ceiling providing the even light, sound, and projection, speakers, and all of that, where this large vinyl screen can be shut or opened as needed for access to the rooms behind. When it's shut entirely and opening as necessary. And so we provided them a kind of calendar of how these screens could operate to allow for and provide for certain scenarios that would help their programming and allow them to run an efficient headquarters. And so you might have no screens active in a sort of dinner party scenario, or a few of these horizontal screens active for a kind of segmented gallery type scenario. This was one of the first exhibitions on gentrification where they used the display wall and a giant discussion space in the back. Or a kind of cocktail party scenario, and this is the opening. But they also work in this space, and so the configurations possible through moving furniture and accessing what, either closing this wall off or accessing portions of that wall. Here's the Board of Trustees meeting in the conference room expanded, et cetera. Or a large lecture scenario in the back. And I know this is an iPhone photo, not very good, but I like it because there's this really great doubling of the heads and the cells. So the face of the project was, the proposal was to create this kind of screen. This part didn't happen, but because this is a landmark facade, and because we wanted to capture the Institute outside in the public realm, this was a kind of screen as trailer, sort of very thick screen, that you could connect to a truck or whatever, and this is roll-up doors, so that it operated as a new face for the Institute when parked in front of the Van Alen, but also could leave and enter the city so that the Van Alen had kind of an extension for pop-up events in the city, wherever they needed. Okay, 3 more projects, and then I'll turn it over to Heather. We were asked to enter the PS1 MoMA competition a couple of years back, and we wanted to objectify the space of the courtyard. So again, we're interested in this, the whole and the space rather than the object. And rather than putting an object in the courtyard, we wanted to celebrate the iconicity of the courtyard through objectifying the space. And so it's about this reflective canopy that droops down and intentionally held at the same height as this wall. We were struggling with this wall, the wall of the Institute, as this kind of barrier to the public. This is the ticketed portion, right? This is the space of the Institute. And so it was about getting outside of the wall or connecting what's happening on the other side of the wall in a few ways. One, through a very dumb mound that users could actually get up and get over the wall, but also that this operated as a kind of informal seating for the events in the courtyard. The wall was then lined with mirror, proposed to be lined with mirror, so that it doubled outside of itself and continued into the public realm. And this pixelated drooping sack was also held a series of triangulated mirrors, so that it's operated as a kind of periscopic relationship between what's inside and outside. So here you see the periscope working, grotto under the mound, and this kind of very low, intimate point where the mirrors recede to also create a kind of escape from, as you will, the context of the courtyard. There's the receding intimate zone. And then intentionally leaving the space of the courtyard completely free and only sort of given definition by this reflective droop that allowed for a kind of strobe light in the evening for the parties and events that they would hold. But David Benjamin won with his Mushroom Tower, so we didn't get it. But on to the next one, right? So this was for a proposal for the Peace Corps. And the site was in Washington, D.C., here, where there's sort of this little dot, and the Capitol's here, the mall. This little traffic island here was meant to be the site of a commemorative work for the Peace Corps' agenda. So how do you represent the agenda of the Peace Corps? Ooh, does this look as pixelated as it is to you? Well, the traffic island is this kind of triangular shape, and it's there are two grids, one that starts from this side and one that starts from this side. And there is this fictitious geography, which is this single undulating line, a single line that finally gets to this point. And as you zoom into this fictitious geography, this kind of spaces for meandering between the sides, where you become aware of the opposite side, but there is this also, because it's glass, there's this sort of undulating glass wall. There is this play of the transparency of boundary and the confusion of sort of which side that you're on. In section, I'll go back, there is this single sort of bowl-shaped void that collects this mess into a single entity, even though that is kind of out of reach, right, or unreachable as you meander through this kind of single boundary condition. But we got fourth place, honorable, but close but not close enough. So now they're working with the finalists on the proposal. The last one I'll show, we won, so that's good. But it was a very small project, but quite fun and quick. It was for the Valentine Pavilion for Times Square. And this, I guess, has happened. This is the 8th year, maybe, that it's been running. This is big proposal or solution, rather, for the Heart several years ago. But rather than create an object in the middle of Times Square, and there's no way, right, you can compete with the spectacle of what's happening in the context. We wanted to create a space that reflected the context back on itself. And so we created this ring of hearts, call it the Heart of Hearts, a series of booths that we called Kissing Booths, playing on the buddy booths of the CD era. And it was about these three conditions, a kind of kaleidoscopic interior, rather, and this kind of reflective ring of the context, and then these intimate booth spaces for 2 or 3 people. And it was about creating this absurd play of the context and the characters in Times Square, and trying to suggest scenarios for use within this pavilion. They held weddings on Valentine's Day in this space. And so here the pavilion in its complete form as a single room made of rooms that reflect the context and the light. We were also very aware of the space of the digital space that this would likely find itself. So we saw this as having two sites. One, the kind of online presence and the physical presence, because of its reflectivity sort of encouraged a sort of selfie generator, if you will, for photographs, and it did play out in that way. And we were interested in the things that happened in the pavilion that became actually a spectacle for the strangers in Times Square. Weddings happened, and dance performances as well. Right. So this kind of relationship was what we were hoping for, where there would be a reversal of the spectator. In one of the kissing booths, snuggling up to some Portman. And I'll end with this drawing I made recently for Storefront's auction, which is a simple drawing of the plan Storefront, to emphasize it's really the space and what happens in it. That's the point. So, thank you.